Hi friends, Father Carey here. This is another Holy Spirit moment. This one inviting you to reflect on how you would react if you learned beyond a shadow of a doubt that you had only 1 month left to live. Our own mortality is something that we tend not to think about overly much, isn't it? We don't want to be confronted with the fact that we intellectually know, but which we tend to shy away from, that we are mortal creatures and that one day we will cease to be. We will die. And yet it's important, it seems to me, for every human being to confront his or her own mortality, because doing so enables us to live a life that is richer and more fulfilled than it otherwise would be. And so, just as a thought experiment, let's you and I reflect on what it would mean if we learned we had only 4 more weeks of life left to us. As the 18th century poet and philosopher Samuel Johnson reminds us, the prospect of imminent death wonderfully concentrates the mind. It is difficult to deny one's own mortality when one is looking at the gallows. Now, Epicurus, the 4th century BC philosopher, tells us that our response ought to be one of indifference. And he says this, "Where I am, death is not, and where death is, I am not. So what's to worry? So long as I'm alive, I'm not dead. And when I'm dead, I won't be alive to know that I'm dead. So there is no reason to be upset about the prospect of one's own mortality." Thus says Epicurus. Those of us who find ourselves in the Christian tradition might agree with Epicurus, but for a different reason. We might say that we are been promised that we will continue to live in some way which we can't quite fathom after the body dies. This is one of the cardinal beliefs of the Christian story. Fair enough, from both Epicurus and from the Christian story. But it seems to me that neither of those possibilities will do much to allay the fear that you and I are likely to experience when we discover that we are on the brink of death. Fear is a common response to the prospect of one's own demise. Death fear is somehow hardwired, I believe, into what it means to be a human being. And that's reasonable, because death is not a phenomenon that we understand, is it? Oh, I know we can chart what happens to the body when the body dies, but what happens to the me, to the I, to consciousness, to our personal identity? That's the question. And that's what makes death so unlike any other fear that we might have. Death is uncanny. We can't quite put our finger on what it means to die. And so as a consequence, we will never be able to allay the fear that we have through reasonable explanations such as the one that Epicurus offers us. Nor will the promise of somehow going home to paradise, as the Christians want to say, is going to allay at least all of our fears, because the journey that we will undertake after we die is not like any other journey we've ever undertaken. We don't know what the destination is, even though we might all the time use the common sorts of platitudes to describe heavenly existence that are familiar to all of us. I think Shakespeare wonderfully expresses the uncertainty of this journey into death that Christian faith can't completely erase. In Hamlet, he has, right after the famous "to be or not to be" passage, he has Hamlet think this: "The undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others we know not of." We just don't know what lies on the other side of the grave. And so assurances, overly pious sometimes assurances that we are going home, may not do much to alleviate our fear. That fear is reasonable, I want to suggest to you. Even Kubla Ross, with her famous 5 stages of dying, has underwriting all of the stages except the final one, death fear. You may recall the 5 stages that she argues a dying person may go through: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and maybe acceptance. She says very few people arrive at that final stage. But if you look at the first four stages, all of them are caused by, motivated by fear of dying. We deny when we get the diagnosis out of fear of death. We become angry. That is frequently a response to fear, isn't it? Sort of the fight or flight alternative that we're all familiar with. We bargain out of fear. If only I can somehow do this, then the prospect of death will be taken away from me. Or we sink into depression, again motivated by fear of dying. So, if our first response to discovering that we have only a short time to live is most likely to be fear, how can we do something about that? How can we fix this initial response? Not completely alleviate our death fear. Again, I think that's hardwired into us as biological evolutionary creatures, but somehow learn to live with it. How can we, as the 17th century philosopher and Dr. Thomas Brown said, how can we make death our neighbor instead of our adversary? How can we learn to coexist with our own mortality instead of seeing it as an adversary that we either need to flee from or to resist as best we can? Let me offer you this suggestion. After years of pastoral experience, being with many, many people who are dying, my conclusion is this: we tend to die as we have lived. If we have lived badly, we will most likely die badly. If we have lived well, we will most likely die well and be able to face the imminent prospect of our death well. Now, what do I mean here? Simply this: a good life depends upon the cultivation of certain virtues that create character in us that enables us to respond in a fruitful way to adverse conditions, to all of the challenges that life might throw at us. The cultivation of the virtue of patience, for example, and courage, and trust, and compassion, and love will all stand us in good stead as we go through the years of our lives. They will enable us to not only relate more fully and richly with other people, but to enjoy the good things which life offers us, as well as to accept the less than good things that life offers us with equanimity. Those same virtues are so very, very important when we arrive at the end of our life. If we have cultivated them, if we, as Aristotle would say, have become habituated to them, then they will sustain us in our final leg of life's journey. That we will be able to meet the prospect of our own demise with the courage that is necessary to do so. We will be able to adjust to the waning physical strength that we will experience with patience. We will be able to show compassion and love for those who are grieving our passing, instead of being so preoccupied and so obsessed with our own death fear that we have no time or room for any others. We will be able to accept the end of our life as something which may be regrettable, but which is inevitable. And to try and fight the inevitable is a mug's game. It is simply foolish. So, in order to make death more of a neighbor than an adversary, we need to begin living well so that we can die well. We need to begin cultivating the kind of character that allows us to accept the fact that our time on earth is limited and that our passing from this life should be done with the dignity and the courage and the compassion and the patience with which life itself ought to be lived. What we need to do, my friends, is to cultivate a way of life that allows us to die well. If you are interested in pursuing this issue more closely, I would invite you to take a look at one of my books, The Art of Living and Dying. Friends, thank you so much. This has been another Holy Spirit moment. If you care to subscribe, I invite you to do so, and I will see you next time. Take care.